Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
All right, greetings everyone, and welcome back to another great episode of IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Daniel Lowry, and in today's episode, well, it is all about our A+ series, and what would a day be like without A+, right? It's a fun topic, and if you're getting started in IT, it's where you gotta kind of get things going. And joining us in the studio to help us get that ball rolling, our good friend, Mr. Wes Bryan. Wes, we're glad to have you, man. How's it going today?
Oh, man, it's going great. Excited to be here. That's right, we are moving along in this series that is 902. And, well, we're going to talk about common preventative methods, if you will, the method to the madness. We're going to talk about how you can keep physical security in check, and we're also going to talk about digital security as well, because it is going to be important. So we're going to go ahead and we're really just going to dive right in. There are a lot of different ways that we can secure our systems. Keep in mind that physical security is very, very important, right? At the end of the day, we can do things like we can encrypt our information, scrambling it in a way that only the authorized people have access to it. But Microsoft has an interesting saying out there. I think they're called the 10 immutable laws of security. Microsoft came up with, and it's probably a military thing. A lot of the security that we talk about in digital security and information systems really started with things like the United States military. And what I'm talking about is, if I can touch your computer, guess what? It's really no longer your computer. If I can run a piece of software on your network, guess what? It's really no longer your network. If I have physical access to your network, it's no longer your network. Right now, I definitely put my own spin on those immutable laws, but it comes down to it that we can do all the things that we want to. We can implement authentication systems. We can make sure that our data is scrambled, but in the end of the day, if people can walk into your building and they can gain access to your systems, how much have you really secured? So we have to keep in mind that one of the first layer of defense is always user awareness and education. But then that second line of defense is the physical security that you need to implement within your systems.
Wes, this is where they commonly refer to this as, gates, guards, and guns kind of thing, right?
Yes.
When we say physical, we mean you can actually put your hands on this, right? There's a physical fence blocking you from accessing the server room. There's a door with a lock in place blocking you from access to some sensitive material. There might actually even be a man with a gun standing next to these things and doing a patrol around the perimeter to make sure that you aren't gaining access to these things, because, like Wes said, if you gain access to it, if you can put your hands on it and start doing things, even if it's just pull the power out of it, now you've denial of service attacked the crap out of me, and no one's gaining access. You successfully implemented that.
That's right. Another way to think of it too, in the military, they called it defense in depth, right? We call it defense in depth. You hear it called defense in depth. If you go up to any Microsoft sites, they've coined the phrase, but that really started with the United States military. You've got to have perimeter security, right? You have to have physical security within your buildings. And, well, let's start right where Dan did, right? Security guards. Security guards are not on the list, but I do want to talk about security guards, and I'm going to mention a couple that aren't on this list that you're going to see as you progress through things like Network Plus and definitely Security Plus, because, well, in Security Plus, it's all about security, right? Well, what's your first line of defense? Well, a lot of times it's a locked door, right? Locked doors are very, very important, right? A locked door creates some kind of physical barrier that's not easily accessible without some kind of force. Now, you guys out there that have lock picks and maybe know how to do the whole shim within the door understand that I know nothing is 100% secure, right? You ask me to show you a 100% secure location, and I'll tell you that one doesn't exist. All right, but understand that's your first line of defense. And then behind that door, right, or maybe even in front of that door, could be a security guard, right? Now, whether a security guard has a gun or not, well, it's dependent on what classification they have. What's the level of necessity for security. But one of the things that all security guards have in common is the fact that they can react in real time to any situation that happens, right? Whether it be somebody that they can physically see in front of them walking up to that secure door, or whether it be monitored on some kind of, closed circuit television, right? The other thing about a security guard is the fact that they can respond in real time to alarms. All right, I want you to think about it, right? Alarms are something that you have to keep in mind too, but alarms, an alarm makes somebody aware if they're in the physical location. And if they're not in the physical location, you do have monitoring systems that can produce alarms, and what do? Right? They call the first responders, people like your law enforcement agency. But if you've got somebody in the building that is already there that can respond to that alarm, they can respond to it in real time. Now, security guards and alarms aren't really in the objectives when it comes to physical security, but they are definitely your first line of defense, and also locked doors. Now, locked doors are. All right, and there's different types of locks that you have out there, and we certainly don't want to get into a whole locksmith episode by any means, but you have things that require like smart cards, right? Smart card authentication. Now, smart cards are, if you will, on the exam. And we all have smart cards here. As I try to dig this out of my pocket here, I've got one in my back pocket that is giving me a hard time coming out. But we have smart cards, right? And this little card, I swipe, and it allows me, or in this case, I just touch it to the electronic pad, and it opens the door. Right? It's got a little cylinder in it that releases, and I can open the door. All right. Now, you also have other types of cards, too. You have things that are called like RFID fobs, and I'm going to end up taking everything out of my pockets in this episode, Dan. So you guys just bear with me here because we do have quite a few cards. Now, this one's a little bit different, all right? You can't really tell it, but that is a lot thicker, right, by comparison to some of the other card that I have, right? So what's the difference between like an RFID card and a smart card? Well, sometimes smart cards do have chips on them. Sometimes they just have a little magnetic strip built into them. But if you look, this one is considerably thicker, all right? And I don't know, in fact, I'll hand that to Dan. Dan, can you see that that's actually two pieces of plastic clipped together? Right? And there's you could actually separate it. Now, please
I've actually done it before.
Oh, have you?
Apart, yeah.
I was going to say, don't separate that or I won't be able to get in my apartment complex tonight.
Let me show you what's inside.
Right? And the difference here is that they can have some kind of logical like circuitry in them, right? In this fact, it's got a little chip in it that's actually programmed and it's matched to my account at my apartment complex. Right, these are also forms of access. You have things like smart card authentication. Now, smart card could be something as like a CAT card. You have in the military, you have what's known as a CAT card, common access card, and in that common access card, it has pretty much the military officer or enlisted, official. It has their entire information within it, right? Government officials also have their own personally identifiable card as well, too, that they have. All right. Now, depending on how sophisticated your machines or your security system is, you could have things like key fobs that are a lot like the RFID sensors, right? RFID, by the way, sorry to hit you guys with an acronym and not explain what it is, right? We're talking about radio frequency identifier. All right, and what they are is that sometimes they can also be called proximity cards as well, and I know that you'll see people call them interchangeably, and sometimes they'll say, hey, technically there's a difference, but with an RFID key fob or an RFID card itself or a badge, if you will, you just basically got to get within proximity of the sensor, and it authenticates you. All right, so these are also things that you can have inside of your devices when it comes to, or for your physical security as well. Other things that you have too, you have tokens. Now, tokens could be physical or they could be software-based, all right? And when we say tokens, what are we talking about? A token really contains things like a personal identifiable number, it could be a username, could be a little bit of temporary information too. That changes every once in a while, and it could match up to like some physical device that you have that has like a 4-digit code. But a token essentially is another way to authenticate yourself. All right, and the reason I say physical is it could be that you do have devices that have tokens that are in cards as well, some of that logical information that I was telling you, but you also have software-based tokens. Where might I find software-based tokens? Well, in a past episode, we've talked about the Windows security system known as the user account control. Well, the user account control, when you create a user account inside of Windows, you get assigned 2 tokens to your account if you're an administrator. All right, now if you're a standard user, you only get 1 token, but if you're an administrator, you get 2 tokens. All right, and what happens is administrators, when they are running and they do not need administrative privileges, they run as a standard user and their standard token applies to there and gives them the lowered privilege access. Now, the moment you trigger the user account control and it blocks you and says you have to interact with it in order to perform this functionality, well, you either have to put in a username or password or you have to click continue in order to elevate your privileges. And when you elevate your privileges, what happens is a logical token gets applied to your account and then you perform your administrative functionalities. And while you're performing those administrative functionalities, that software-based token is applied to your user account. But then when you no longer need those privileges, silently in the background, under the hood in the operating system, Windows goes, all right, let's switch this back out. We'll put your standard token back on. That's why you can see in multiple instances in a single logged in session, the user account control will trigger many different times because it doesn't run you continuously with that administrative token. All right, it's called a privilege escalation. Now, where there are attacks where people try to do privilege escalation, right? We talk about rootkits. Rootkits got the name because originally what they would do is they would try to run as a root user in the Linux-based systems, Unix systems, right? Well, today we call rootkits because they still try to gain privileged access, but if you will, what they're trying to do is maybe not the same thing, and obviously in Windows because there isn't a root user account. But keep in mind, right, that's what happens. A privilege escalation happens, your software-based token gets applied to your user account, and then in the background, when you no longer need those privileges, Windows reduces your privileges back down to the least amount. Now, that also comes to common prevention methods that we do have to talk about that are in the list. It's called the principle of least privilege. All right? So what is the principle of least privilege? Well, that means if you don't need those privileges to do your daily job, you're not going to gain access to them. You're not going to get those.
It's funny. Mike and I were talking this morning about crazy security things that we've encountered throughout our careers. One was where I worked at a place that I worked. And I'm not going to mention any names because it was pretty horrible. The domain account was hdesk, and the password for it was help.
Oh, great.
And everybody knew what it was. And Mike said he knew a guy that called him up, went to work for a company, and every user, and this was in a Windows Active Directory domain, every user was a domain admin. These are bad security practices, ladies and gentlemen. It's like what Wes was just talking about where you have the two tokens. If you're just a standard user, you don't need, that's why you have people like us and yourself one day to do these things for you. You call and say, I need access to this. I need you to do this for me. That's what they get paid to do. You don't give everybody the keys to the kingdom because then everybody has keys to the kingdom and they can hurt you, right? So you want to keep that privilege down to just who actually needs it.
Definitely, and that's one of the reasons that they, Windows, I say Windows basically gave birth to the UAC, but what really happened was Windows came on board with what was already happening in things like your Unix and Linux-based systems. If you don't need root user access, don't use it, right? Yeah. So principle of least privilege says that we give you just the privileges that you need to perform your day-to-day job, no more, no less, right? And it's not until you need those privileges that if you're a standard user, you make a phone call. If you're an administrator, you get a privilege escalation, whichever one happens first. All right, so some of the other things that we also have to keep in mind are things like cable locks, all right? When we talk about cable locks, I do want you to understand that there are a few different kinds that you have out there. And when it comes to cable locks, and in fact, let me go ahead and show you what I mean. I've kind of pulled up a website here. Let's give Triton their credit here because it is their image, and you can always get, they're not very expensive. And like I said, let's give credit to where credit's due. And you can see that it's a locking mechanism that actually physically locks the machine down to the desk, right? Now, even more so, you need this in things like laptops because why? Laptops are mobile, right? Portability is key to a laptop. Well, I don't want a laptop just being able to grow legs and walk out the door, if you will. So Noble laptops, or Noble Locks here, and again, giving them credit because this is their website and their pictures. They have some great ones here for things like iPads and, for instance, like this MacBook Pro. This is a really, really cool setup. Look how it just locks right to the MacBook itself, and then you have a lock on the back. All right. You can also hear sometimes they're called Kingston locks too. You have them likewise. Now, some of the other things that we have what are known as privacy filters, and I'll go ahead and show you a privacy filter. Here's one from 3M by CDW here. You can also, no, that's okay. I don't have any questions. I know what I'm looking at. If you look here, a privacy filter is really good. Now, privacy filters can also be called anti-glare filters. For obvious reasons, right? Cutting down the glare. But one of the great things about privacy filters is, we talk about social engineering, and we'll definitely talk about in our security section a little bit more, not right here in this security episode, but Social engineering, one of the easiest things that you can do is look over somebody's shoulder surfing, right? And I can find out what you're doing, maybe see what kind of password you're typing in, or maybe the documents that you're working with, and get some good personal identifiable information, or even some PHI, some protected healthcare information. Well, you put one of these privacy filters over there, and it kind of brings your computer's display back to the earlier passive matrix screens that didn't have a wide viewing angle. You literally had to sit right in front of them, right? So that's what a privacy filter is. Like I said, you might even see them called anti-glare filters, but they can be used for either or. All right, as far as physical security goes, some of the last couple of things that we got to talk about. They talk about securing physical documents, passwords, and shredding. All right. When it comes to passwords, there are a few different things that we can do. All right.
Wes, like my previous thing I was talking about, where the username and password for the domain admin account was hdesk and the password was help. I'm guessing help is a bad example of a secure or strong password.
that is a very bad example, and let's just understand, because, well, more than one person knew it, let alone how strong it was, right? We look in security, right, and I don't know if they're going to call this out, but let's go ahead and address the three principles of security, right? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. All right. Confidentiality is making sure only the authorized people have access to the data or the systems that hold the data. Integrity is making sure that it maintains its original state, right? Maintains its integrity. And availability, again, is making sure that authorized users have access to it. Now, there's a fourth one in there that's kind of like a cousin, and that's called non-repudiation. All right, we want to have some kind of accountability where I say, hey, Dan, that was your communication. I don't want Dan to be able to say, it wasn't me. Well, when you got something like that where everybody knows the password right away, that means I can't tell who did what, right? I can't say, hey, Dan, that was you. Dan could say, I wasn't even in the state at that time, right? Well, yeah, it was. I seen your username or whatever was logged in here. Well, you know what? Sally's also got it, Bob's got it, and Bill's got it as well. All right? So first of all, sharing passwords is not a good way to protect your documents, right? So let's talk about strong passwords. So don't share, and help is definitely a bad password. So what constitutes a strong password? I've got a few examples of what you can do here, all right? And one of the things that we need to understand is, first of all, it's resilient to attacks, all right? And we'll show you how you get there here in a second. It's resilient to password-based attacks. And there's all different kinds, and we'll talk about those coming up in another episode. All right, they're changed regularly, right? We don't want the same password, such as help, being the password all the time, day in and day out. Why is that? Well, it gives hackers all the time they need to attack it, right? And we want it resilient. We want it to be a stand up against attacks.
Passwords are like underwear.
That's right. Change them regularly, right? It's the same thing as jocks change their socks,
right.
before, you don't wear the same socks unless they feel flies are lucky, right?
That's right, unless
we've
flies
heard
are
that
lucky.
before,
That's
right? Multiple character sets, and we'll talk about the character sets coming up. Increased character length. Now, some of you guys and gals out there are probably already security centric, so please let's not go down the path of whether increased character lengths versus complexity is better or worse. But if I have help, right, what is that, H-E-L-P, that's 4 letters, well, that's probably not as strong as even, let's just basically said help, the word help 3 times, right? You got a longer password, all right, keep in mind. And these are typically controlled through policies, all right? Very basically, understand that they're controlled in a corporate environment unless it was Dan's old job.
We changed that, by the way.
You changed that, right?
That implementation went out ASAP.
That's right. They're typically controlled through a policy. So, all right, let's understand the multiple character sets. That's something that you definitely want to know. If you're not aware about character sets, there are 4 possible character sets on your keyboard if you look at them at any time, all right? We have letters, but we have letters that can be in 2 different states, right? Capital letters versus lowercase letters. Those are 2 character sets. We also have numbers, 0 through 9, as well as special characters. And there's a bunch of them. You guys and gals out there can look down at your keyboard right now and see the various special characters that you have on your keyboard. When we change our passwords often, when we require greater character length, right? 8 characters, 9 characters, 10 characters, whatever your company might use. And then we require what's known as password complexity. Complexity means you're going to use one of each one of these character sets. Now, you start to get passwords that are a little bit more resilient or stronger against password-based attacks. All right, and I can actually show you in an operating system, let's see here, I'm still logged in, yep, where we control this, right? Now, keep in mind that if you're in a corporate environment, centralized servers, probably where you're going to be controlling this, but the settings will be the same, they will look the same, but they're going to be controlled from a different location. The great thing is you can also control them locally on your computers here as well. All right. Now, when Dan said we changed that policy ASAP, let me show you what he was talking about. All right. So if I drop down to, I tell you what, I'll drop down to the modern or Metro UI, and I'm going to type something known as gpedit.msc. All right, this is our group policy editor, right? In this case, it's a local group policy editor. Please understand, ladies and gentlemen, on the A+ exam, they're not going to expect you to know group policy. However, you might need to know about password policy settings, all right, how we can control that. All right, and if I go into our local computer policy and I expand out computer configurations, Windows settings, and then security settings, notice that we've got a couple of different things that we can control right here, but the one that I really want to look at, right, is this account policy. Remember, we're talking about user accounts. And if I expand this out, I've got password policy. All right, and if I expand that out, I've got absolutely nothing. I've always loved that, where you expand that out, a little triangle out, and all it does is makes it disappear. But if I go over here into the context pane, I can see that enforcing password history. Password history just means how many times do you have to come up with a unique password before you can reuse a password. All right, maximum password age is how long before I change the password, right? Regularly change these, again, means you're using a new unique password, and it makes it harder for the hackers to attack. Minimum password age says, how long do I have to use a password before I can change it, right? Password length is really one that we want to understand, is how many characters does it have to be. And password complexity means those character sets. All right, if I implement password complexity, I've got to use those character sets. And that, again, will increase the strength of the password. Now this one here, storing passwords using reversible encryption, I don't want you to worry about that one. That one's one that's not commonly used. It used to be that if a service needed to authenticate needed to use your password, it couldn't store it in a format that was scrambled, right, or encrypted, as they say, right? So what they'd have to do is store it in plain text, and it greatly reduces security, so it's not one that's commonly used. So that is one of the ways that you can protect documents. Now, they also talk about physical documents too, right? And we talk about physical documents. One of the ways that you protect that, you do implement things like retention policies. You make sure that documents aren't just sitting by the printer, right? If you're printing out things like payment card information, that happens sometimes where people like to leave things on the printer. You're making sure that they're kept and secure. You might have a secure or clean desk policy that says all personal information has to be secured and physically locked as well. All right, some of the last things that we have to talk about when it comes to digital security. We've talked about user authentication. We've talked about strong passwords. How about we talk about something known as multi-factor authentication? We talk about multi-factor authentication. There are three, well, there's more than that today just as technology progresses, but there's primarily three main ones that I want you to worry about when it comes to authentication factor. Something you know, something you have, and something you are. All right. Something you know is usually a username and password, or a PIN, personal identification number, right? Something that you know that you have to plug in. Could be a security question. If you ever had to answer a security question, that's an example of something you know. It's an authentication factor. Something you have. We've mentioned RFID key fobs or RFID badges, if you will, smart cards. It's something you possess. Last one is something you are, right? This is some personal trait of yourself, a physical characteristic, and this is where biometrics comes in. Biometrics used to be, when I first started teaching this, I would say, very expensive implementation and only the most secure places are going to have it. And now every one of our smartphones, pretty much a lot of our smartphones have it built right into the device, right? Things like your fingerprint recognition systems, voice recognition systems, hand geometry scanners, if you will, retinal patterns, iris scanners, all some kind of physical characteristic of yourself that is biometric.
It's funny, Hollywood makes it like there's another one of those little categories there. It's something I have that is something you are, right?
Oh, interesting.
Right, hand scanner. Well, you don't need that hand.
That's right. That's right.
Hollywood always does that,
Yes.
right?
I want my eyes back.
Yeah,
Why?
no,
Because
no.
they're mine.
I got to get into this locked box here.
That's right.
I can't just have you open it through threat of pain.
That's right. So on the exam, remember, multi-factor authentication is more than one of those authentication factors, right? So if I say username and password, that isn't multi-factor because that's two things you know. Don't let that trick you up. But if I say you have to have a username and password and you have to have a key fob that hits this electronic door, now you have multi-factor authentication. If I say you have to have a key fob and a fingerprint scanner, now you have more than one authentication factor. It becomes multi-factor authentication. The other thing that we want to implement are things like directory permissions, all right? And this goes, directory permissions are usually coupled with user authentication in the fact that when we say directory permissions, I just want you to think about your basic NTFS permissions and share permissions that are on your local machines, right? I have an ACL, an access control list that defines what level of access somebody has to a file. Well, guess what? Inside of your corporate environments where you're dealing with a domain environment where there's a directory, you just implement permissions. I say, okay, Dan's part of the administrative group. Guess what? He gets full control access to the network documentation. Wes is a standard user. Guess what? You don't even get to read the documentation. So basically, directory permissions define what level of access you have over the resources that are contained within that directory, within that database, if you will. All right. Other things too, implementing things like VPN communications. VPNs, remember, virtual private networks. VPN communications are the way we implement something known as tunneling. All right, and this is a way we can take a public infrastructure, something, a network infrastructure that's owned by somebody else, and we can create this virtualized point-to-point connection across it. And then we encrypt the communication between those endpoints, essentially scrambling that data within that tunnel, providing an extra level of protection. We also want to worry about things like, well, data loss prevention. DLP, it's got a couple of different acronyms: data leak protection and data loss protection. All right, data loss protection could be the fact that you're implementing a RAID 1 configuration so that if a hard drive fails, you have access to it. You have backups. That's data loss prevention. Data leak prevention is making sure that you have user authentication, making sure that you physically secure documents so that it doesn't end up in the wrong hands, implementing social media policies that make sure that your users aren't using things like social media and leaking data out to people that they shouldn't be. Disabling ports, right? We talked about ports as basically a logical endpoint of a connection, right? If I'm going to be using something like SMTP, then that means on my computer, port 25 is open. Well, guess what? If I'm not using SMTP and I'm using IMAP, which is port 143, there's no reason to have port 25 open on my computer. Disable the port, right? Essentially what you do is you disable the service and it disables the port that's associated with the service. We've mentioned access control lists, smart cards, email filtering. All right, that's a big one, right? Because if you think about email filtering in general, you want to have some kind of email policies that make sure that only the people that you expect to be emailing you into your company are the ones that are emailing you. You have spam protection as well, right? Trusted and untrusted software. When we talk about trusted and untrusted software, you have things built into, like, for instance, Windows called the Smart Screen filter. All right, you have the user account control. And what happens there? Well, the next thing that I'm going to talk about is across all operating systems and digital signatures that are applied to software. What does a digital signature do? Well, a digital signature just means I can verify that the publisher, who the publisher is of that software. And then I can take that digital signature and use an operation on the software itself to make sure that it hasn't been modified in any way. You have things inside of, like, for instance, Smart Screen filter inside of Windows that looks at the data within the metadata within that software and says, hey, let me reach out to Microsoft. They maintain something known as a reputation database and find out, do I recognize the publisher, or does Smart Screen filter recognize the publisher? And if it does, you might not even be aware that anything happened. The user account control just makes sure that you are aware that something's going to download to your computer and make a modification to your registry, but it is a known trusted installation source, and all you got to do, if you're an administrator, is continue. However, there are times when it says, I don't know who this is. And if it doesn't know who it is, you better trust the source, right? Because I've seen that before, where just because Windows doesn't recognize it doesn't mean that it's a malicious piece of software. It just means that maybe the company's going through an update process and updating the software's digital signature, and it hasn't made it to the database. So trusted, known installation sources is important, right? All right, user education, we kind of talked about that already. Remember, any kind of security implementation and preventative method means that the first thing that has to happen is your users have to be aware of why they don't click on emails coming from people that they're not aware of, or downloading and installing that piece of software that they have no clue where it came from, right? Education is the first line of defense, all right? Last but not least, we have, I know we're running short on time here, Dan. Last but not least, I want to talk about anti-malware and antivirus as well as firewalls. All right. So what does a firewall do? Well, we got firewalls we've talked about pretty extensively in other episodes, but we'll go ahead and real quickly we'll include it here. Remember that it protects information coming into your computer, into your network, and going out of your computer or out of your network. All right. Now, what am I talking about? When I talk about coming into your network, I mean you have what are known as network-based firewalls, and they control traffic going to any computer inbound or outbound of your network, the entirety of your network. You also have what are known as host-based firewalls, like the Windows firewall, right? Like IP tables inside of Linux, if you will, Nix-based systems that controls the traffic that's going in and out of the operating system itself on the host, hence the term host-based firewall. But then you also have anti-malware, antivirus software, and there are two different kinds as well. And like firewalls, the same thing applies. You have what's known as a host-based anti-malware or antivirus software, and that's like Windows Defender that just runs on the one machine, just on the Windows operating system there that it's protecting. But you also have network-based antivirus and anti-malware solutions that run in things like your next-generation firewalls that are screening all of the traffic coming in and out of your network. All right? So a few different things that you have to be aware of on the exam. Let me just look back. Looks like, oh, you know, the last thing I think I didn't mention here in preventative methods is when it comes to physical documents, one of the other ways that you can secure it is through proper disposal, right? Making sure that people, just throw it in the dumpster, right? We have a social engineering tactic called dumpster diving when people try to actually gain your information by diving in the dumpster and pulling that information out and being able to read it. All right, you have companies that'll have protected bins that will come on site to your company and they will shred the documents, right? So much so that you can't rebuild the information, right? So that is another part of physical security that I wanted to include there. And last but not least, we talked about a security guard being one of the first lines of defense. Guess what the security guard should always have? An entry roster, an entry control roster. It says, are you on the list? Okay, you're allowed in. You're not on the list? Okay, well, are you allowed a visitor's pass? Maybe, but either way it's documented. Knowing who is coming in and out of your building physically can help to really stop a lot of these attacks before they happen. So quite a few different common prevention methods. Just make sure that you are implementing a layered defense system, and it always starts with user awareness.
All right, Wes, it was a really good primer on computer security. Really is what it boiled down to at the end of the day. These are the common things that you need to be aware of when it comes to just standard, straightforward computer security. We want to make sure that you guys are up to stuff when it comes to that. Wes, when it comes, is there anything else that we needed to cover before we close the show?
Yeah, there is one thing I forgot in user awareness is an acceptable use policy, an AUP they call out. So just real quickly, remember that if you're using wireless networks or you're using computer software, you're using the computers, kiosks within your networks and stuff, a lot of times you might have what's called an AUP. That's just an acceptable use policy. It defines the proper use of any information system and the intellectual or information or physical property of a company. One last one I wanted to throw in.
Not a problem, Wes. Do thank you for that. And thank you for stopping by. We do thank our audience for watching as well. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. And signing off for IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Daniel Lowry.
And I'm Wes Bryan.
We'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.